Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again on a new episode of Muslim Youth Podcast. Today's episode is going to be one that is extremely timely, sensitive, and addressing complex issues. We are going to be talking about Black Muslim youth. And we have with us our guest, Mr. Kofi Achampong, who is going to be joining us to explore all of these issues with us. So, to begin with, thank you very much for joining us. And why don't you start by introducing yourself, talking a little bit about your work and how you got involved in working with these types of issues?
Yeah, certainly. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me here, Jafar. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So my name is Kofi Achampong. I'm by profession. I'm a lawyer actually by profession, and my work in as a lawyer encompasses quite a few issues. That would be considered matters of uh, in your areas of litigation, in administrative law, in criminal law, in human rights law, employment law, civil litigation itself. So it's very broad. Um, so from a professional standpoint, that brings me into contact with a lot of interesting cases that have some relevance and impact for the groups, the communities. I think that we're going to be talking about. Um, I have many clients who, of course, have gotten in contact with the criminal justice system, law enforcement. Some of whom were wrongly targeted. Some of whom may have just gotten caught up with the wrong crowd at some point in their life. So it's something that, from a professional standpoint, I engage in. I also support clients who, at times, have wanted to bring litigation against the government, who've lost their jobs because of some alleged connection to people who the government deems as being dangerous. Um, so I have clients who contact me who have been approached by police who have been randomly stopped by security agents, and so it can really run the gamut. In terms of how I find myself on this platform, um, I think it really starts with my own conversion to Islam. I was born as a Muslim. I grew up actually in a very religious Christian household, and I'm the only Muslim in my immediate family. And I actually converted to Islam almost 10 years ago, whilst I was working as an articling student in Switzerland, actually, which was an interesting experience. Of course, I had many friends from the Muslim community, all over the Muslim community, not just the Muslim community, but also other religious communities, but within the broad spectrum of the Muslim community, not from any one denomination or group within the broad Muslim community. So I've always been sort of around Muslims, I guess, perhaps since I was in high school, but more so when I started university a long time ago in 2001, which was a very interesting year, I think, for the world. So there's a lot that has brought me here. If I were to kind of go into all that detail, I think we would be spending a lot of time talking about my personal story. The other thing that's brought me here, I guess, is that I have a good friend who works with the Muslim community and with government, and he told me about this organization and the work that they're doing, and asked me if I'd be interested in joining to share a little bit of my own experience, the work I do within the Black and the Muslim community. As somebody who helped start an organization called the Black Muslim Initiative, which tries to tackle issues that are at the intersection of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, and to develop resources, educate, and be an advocate for issues that impact both the Muslim community and the Black community, and particularly the Black Muslim community. So, long way of saying that a lot of things have brought me here, I guess.
Yeah, so thank you very much, as we said, for a fascinating journey that got you here. The perhaps one of the first questions I'd like to ask you, obviously you're dealing with a lot of stuff, a lot of issues, and if you were to drill it down to maybe the three top issues, what would it be? And I know it's a tough question.
The three top issues in terms of my professional work, you mean?
Well, with this topic. So this topic with related to Black Muslim youth, what would you say would be the top priorities if we wanted to tackle things? Because these are the top three issues that you encounter. Yes.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so that's a good question. Obviously, Black Muslim youth, like any demographic, they have their challenges that they share in common with the broader society. Youth from every community and background. What's unique about being, I guess, both Black and Muslim in a country like Canada is that it's these sort of intersecting identities that can sometimes hinder or make it difficult for you to feel like you are comfortable within this society. All of us at some point, particularly those of us who are visible minorities, racialized people, many of us, we are dealing with the fact that we don't often find ourselves reflected in the dominant culture, right? We aren't seeing ourselves oftentimes in positions of leadership, at the top of organizations, at the top of various spheres of societal activity. We are oftentimes trying to be, get into those spaces where we can actually apply ourselves and gain opportunity, and we want to normalize that for ourselves. There are a lot of things that are unique about the Black community that impact youth who also identify as Black and Muslim. And I think anybody who has been watching, what's been going on in the world over the last, year and a half, maybe much longer than that, you've kind of seen basically, a bit of an awareness grow around issues of, police use of force, what they call anti-Black racism, which is really the idea that people who appear Black, so someone like me who would be considered Black in a North American context, they can find themselves victims of various forms of discrimination, of prejudice and bias, and that it's so normalized within our society that people don't even take issue with it, or they seem to sort of be completely ignorant about it. But this is not new. North America, the countries that we identify with this North American continent, and South America, these were places that were populated by enslaved Africans for over 400 years. People that would be considered Black have been here for many years. Some people say even before European colonizers came to this part of the world. But obviously, what happened with the tragedy, the trauma, the reality of the European Atlantic slave trade is that it set into motion a type of conflict between the people who are of Black African descent and the dominant white supremacist society that had colonized this country and had suppressed the First Nations people and even this entire continent. So that narrative, that reality, those systems, those cultural forces that help shape relationships between who should have power, who shouldn't have power, who are the oppressors, who are not the oppressors. That reality is still very much part of the institutions that we work within, and are reflected in many parts of our world. And in the United States, it gets a lot of attention because of the sizable population of the African American community there. But it's really, a story that's consistent with wherever you find that, enslaved Africans were taken to in the Americas, right? And have been trying for many years to sort of find their freedoms, to be considered full human beings in society. And that struggle is ongoing. Now, if you can imagine that that's the reality that has been ongoing in this part of the world for a long time, add on to that the element of Islam, which has also been at times throughout history the opposing sort of cultural and religious force to the dominant sort of Judeo-Christian sort of civilizations. So it presents a very unique sort of challenge for Black Muslims who are obviously Black and deal with what that comes with, the stigma, the biases, the prejudices that come with that, and then of course to also be considered part of a group or a religious faith or a religious group that has become recently very much the target of racists, of white supremacists, and people who want to put this picture of a clash of cosmic civilizations in a way between Islam and the West, and so that means that a young black man, he's liable to be arrested, detained, charged, far more than any other group. He's liable to have police use deadly force against him, far more than any other group. He's liable to receive harsher sentences, far more than any other group. And this is just within the realm of sort of the criminal justice system. But again, what we're talking about is a system that pervades almost all facets of our of mainstream society, where you find disproportionately, people who identify in this Black category at the lower rungs of socioeconomic data and status. Again, if you're Muslim, then of course that means that you're also more likely to face discrimination. With government, you face higher scrutiny in certain areas of life, and in a post September 11th world, be the target of law enforcement and be viewed as somebody suspicious just because of your faith. So there's a lot that somebody who identifies within both these categories as both Black and Muslim would have to deal with on a constant basis as they make their way through this society.
Absolutely. I think you touched on so many things here, so many issues and themes that intersect with each other. I think there's a whole, topic and theme that can be unpacked here with regards to, everything you mentioned about the legacy, the heritage that has been received by the present from all the decisions and all the realities that have happened before. There's certainly a huge component. I think in law, since that's your background, I think they refer to this as a path dependency. right? So there are
Mm-hmm.
decisions that are made at some point that create a system, and then everybody who comes afterwards is kind of stuck dealing with the decisions that have been made sometimes centuries ago, and it takes a whole
Yeah,
lot of invested energy and engagement to undo a lot of that. So I think that creates
absolutely.
all the space for these other issues that you're mentioning. So, and I'd like to unpack some of this with you. Part of it certainly has to do with our identities. So the identity of the youth as both a black and a Muslim, for instance, and there's a huge theme there. Then there is
Yeah,
the issue of perhaps underrepresentation, right? So that when you look at the decision making and the power dynamics in society, you see that those who hold the power uh, is not a class that is representative of all of society. And you see that this component is certainly missing, especially when we
yeah,
zone in on black Muslim youth. And then,
yeah,
of course, the last one is I think all the discrimination, prejudice, biases that you see come up as a consequence of all of this, right? So when we take all of this into consideration,
yeah,
I think there is absolutely a lot to unpack there. Um, what is your experience
yeah,
as you go through these? Let's start with the identities. Do you feel, I think part of the identity formation process is, for instance, having role models, knowing who you are in the community, in the society, in the world. And so in the case
yeah.
of a black Muslim, how do you think this plays out?
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good question. To be quite honest with you, yeah, no, I think you can imagine, as a young person, and so the vast majority of Black Muslim youth in Canada, let's say Canada for example, um, they come from recent waves of immigration from the African
Mhm.
continent. But there have been, Black Muslims in Canada for a very long time, and Black communities in Canada for a very long time. A lot of it has not been documented, and there's a lot of relationship, of course, with Islam and the Black communities that came here. One of one of one of the more well-known scholars who does sort of research in this area, Dr. Hakeem Quick, he's mentioned that and this is just to provide some background, but an estimated 15 to 30%, it said, an estimated 15 to 30% of all of the enslaved Africans that were brought here from Africa to the Americas are said to have been Muslim.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. So I mean, since the 1600s, and there's a lot of evidence of Muslims having been captured and brought over here on slave ships, and doing their best to try and hold on to their Islamic identities. Various cases. Sometimes you have records of them having completely written the Quran in Arabic. Many of them were knowledgeable from a certain class of society in their cultures, in their homelands, and then they found themselves completely enslaved. And over time, they lost their religion. Right? They were not allowed to practice their religion. They were forced to adopt new religions, new names, and over time, that Islamic presence, that idea that Islam, Black Muslims have been here for a long time, started to wither away. So most people, they don't even realize that long before Black Christians, for example, were here, Black Muslims came here. And even before the European slave trade, a lot of history demonstrates that there were even ships sent here from West Africa at the behest of Muslim leaders and kings who left artifacts and remnants here that demonstrate that Muslim empires had been coming to the Americas. West African Muslim empires have been trying to come to contact with North America for long before even the European slave trade. So the presence of Black Muslims here predates a lot of things. Yet we don't know much about that. Now, because of that, this new generation, the generation that I'm a part of, the generation that younger people are a part of, they feel like perhaps this is not their society. Perhaps this is a place where they're just completely detached, where they have no roots, where there's no relationship between what's happened on the history of this part of the world and their culture, and their religion and their faith. So that lack of a knowledge, that not lack of awareness, kind of makes you feel extra othered. You feel like I don't belong here. My religion is kind of seen as foreign, as it's seen as not belonging to this part of the world. My color is seen as foreign, is seen as not belonging to this part of the world. Particularly in any kind of respectful manner. So it's natural. It makes sense that because we lack awareness of the history of the Black Muslim presence in this part of the world, many of us, we come into Islam, and many of us who come from the African continent, whether or not we were born into Muslim families, whether we were converts like myself, we don't see the connections between the people who were brought here by force and helped create this society, help build this society, help make America, for example, the greatest economy in the world right now. And the fact that actually many of those people had Muslim names, had Muslim ancestors, were attached to Islam, used to try and bury their dead facing towards Mecca. So we don't know these things. Now, fast forward to the development of the Muslim presence in America, and there's a tremendous amount of history around how Islam became present in America in particular, and how from that process, you eventually get people like the Muhammad Ali's, the Malcolm X's, many of whom go through various pathways of Islam, various denominations, to get to a place where I guess they're seen as representative in many ways of mainstream Islamic identities and schools of thought, denominations and whatnot. But nevertheless, there's a very strong presence here that was developed in part because of people like that, who were unapologetic about their being Black, unapologetic about their they being Muslim and being proud of their Islam, and that's part of the kind of the narrative that many Black Muslims youth are not really aware of in this part of the world. They might be aware of the history of Black Muslims maybe in the countries that they come from outside of the North Americas, but in an American context or in a North American context, that connection hasn't always been made. And I think in many ways that leads to kind of the dislocation, if you will, that many youth may feel, that they're kind of between worlds, between cultures, that the religion that they see at home, that they practice with their parents, isn't visible to them outside. And so they're kind of walking in different worlds as they engage society, and never become comfortable fully within themselves, right? Many of them end up, becoming ashamed of, projecting their religion. They became ashamed of feeling like if people know that they're Muslim, that maybe they'll be viewed as terrorists, or somehow connected to terrorism. They'll be viewed as suspicious, a sort of a fifth column in society, trying to undermine, democracy and liberalism. So it makes sense that eventually they kind of can feel, a sense of dislocation, and there's not an easy way to always address that. One of the challenges that I've encountered in my work is that the main institutions that many young people, Black Muslim or not, utilize to help form their identity as Muslims are the mosques, right? You go to the mosque, you go there for prayers, you go there for Eid, you go there for iftars, what have you. You end up kind of sort of centering your life around that environment. The mosques, however, are not always well equipped, right, to understand the youth that they're dealing with, right? These are institutions that were put up by oftentimes our fathers, our uncles, many of whom spent much of their life in another part of the world, and are doing their best here to kind of hold on to their faith and their culture. And the challenges that the youth today are bringing to them in this context, they're not always well equipped to deal with. And many of that, as you've rightly pointed out, Jaffer, has a lot to do with the fact that these youth are walking in different worlds. They feel a bit of discomfort. They don't see themselves and their issues and their ways of thinking reflected, both in the mosques and sometimes even outside the mosques. And so that becomes an easy pathway to feel like you don't really belong in mainstream society.
Excellent points that you're raising, Brother Kofi. So, if I drill a little bit further into the points that you raised around the identity, I think from there we can kind of get to the root cause of other things that are actually symptoms. So I see it kind of appearing in two ways, in two streams. One of them is how these youth are actually perceiving themselves and how they perceive their own identity. And this is actually something that I would say is endemic in our communities in general, where growing up, you feel that you're almost carrying two personalities, two distinct identities. There is the one that is at home and perhaps at the mosque and within certain parts of the community. And then there's the other one that you put on display when you're in the outside world. And a lot of it has to do with the things that you pointed out, which is, this feeling of not belonging and not really being part of the society, being peripheral, marginalized, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like the self-perception. That's on one side. And then how this may manifest itself in terms of actions is because you're not identifying with the other members of the societies you're living in. It becomes a mentality of us and them. And oftentimes, this is where you run into the problems of, you have to hustle and you have to fight for yourself and your identity, as though we are not all one and part of the same whole. Right? So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of these. So on the one side, this false or true multiple personality disorder, if I can refer to it that way.
Yeah.
And on the other side, what are some of the issues that derive out of this in terms of practical actions that are taken by the youth and where they may end up? And I think in a lot of cases, that's where you encounter them, unfortunately, in the line of your work.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Hakeem Quick, he likes to talk about how sometimes you have Muhammad at home and then he's Mo outside, and Bilal at home and then he's Billy outside, right? Because it's the unique reality of being a minority, right? And trying to fit into the dominant culture, it's not an easy thing. Now it can go various ways, because out of a reaction or a fear, a person might only throw themselves into a community and an environment where they think they're safe, right? Where they're not going to be challenged to get to know other people, where they're going to feel like what they've been taught by their parents, by their religious leaders, will be reinforced, and it gives them a sense of safety, right? This is the worldview you've been taught, so people reflect that to you every day, and life is easy. This is the world as it is. But the more you engage with the world outside of what you've been, what you've encountered, the more, a mirror is being held up to you, right? And you start to see, okay, well, these people, they're different than us. They pray differently than us. They hold various different theological views than us, but they have the same issues, they have the same concerns, they have the same goals, they have the same fears, they have the same challenges that we have, and so you're forced to sort of start seeing people, in their multiple sort of layers of identity, as human beings, which is important, because I mean, this world is full of multiplicity and diversity, and it's that way, whether you like it or not. What tends to happen, I think, for a lot of youth, and I can speak about maybe Black Muslim youth that I've encountered, is I think they're looking for something that gives them a sense of groundedness and empowerment, right? How do I feel empowered in a society that I feel wants to disempower me, or wants to label me with tropes and identities that or concepts that aren't inspiring for me, or that make me want to remove my affiliation to my cultural community, my religious community. And so what they might do then is they might say, well, who understands me, right? So I mean, I'll tell you, as someone who comes from an immigrant family. When I came to North America, I was 6 years old, and we grew up in the inner cities of Toronto. Grew up in sort of low income housing communities, and what you encounter there are a bunch of people from all over the world, and people who don't really know each other culturally. Jamaicans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, Somalis, Ethiopians. They're all in these environments together, and sometimes they don't really know much about each other, but their children start interacting, right? The parents, don't know oftentimes much about the other cultures, but they're in these, high rises together, these communities together oftentimes, and the children start interacting, and the children start seeing. They start viewing the society that they're in. They see that, oh, okay, well, we live in the poor parts of our city. We live in those areas of our city that we see a lot of police presence. Okay, why is that? We see sometimes a lot of sometimes gang presence. Why is that? We see a lot of low-income workers in our area. Why is that? Why are there no jobs around here? Why are all these people having to leave their community to go and find work in another community? Why is there limited access, even, if you will, to resources and services? So they start sort of realizing that, oh, okay, so we are kind of a bit of an underclass, if you will, right? And so you start to feel like, oh, okay, well, I guess we are the underclass of society, mainstream, media kinds of represents us as an underclass, sometimes stigmatizes us, and makes us feel like we are peripheral to actual power and worth in our society. So what's a young person supposed to do in that environment? Well, they're going to try and find a way to find worth and to find value in that society. So you'll look around and you'll say, well, who do I see that I feel like is experiencing what I experience? And so naturally, for many of us who kind of, for example, came from the African continent, we looked up to, the people we saw, in music videos, in entertainment, in sports, because they gave us something to aspire to. That's where we saw ourselves represented. And we saw some level of praise. Society seemed to praise some of these Black athletes and their skill level. They seem to praise these entertainers and their ability to entertain.
That's what success looks like.
That's what success looks like, right? So we didn't have a lot of accountants and doctors and lawyers and these things. They weren't readily around us all the time, and if they were very few in number. And we didn't know, where they were. So we naturally sort of gravitate to, the people who we thought, well, somehow you've made it, and somehow you've also kind of been praised by society, and so we're gonna start adopting mannerisms, right? That we see reflected in there, and we know that also, for example, particularly with like the culture of for example, hip hop culture, which came out of a resistance, right, to oppression, which came out of a desire to create something in an environment where Black Americans have been ghettoized and removed from mainstream American society. That was an opportunity to be creative, to show your talents and empower. And it's intoxicating, it's exciting. So naturally, for someone like myself and my friends, we found ourselves gravitating towards that, wanting to be like the people we would see on TV as representatives of blackness, as representatives of Black malehood. And sometimes what we didn't realize is that they were only showing us one version of what it means, right? We weren't allowed to see multiple versions of what it means. That you could be an entertainer, you could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could be a professional, you could be all of these things in this society, and you can contribute. You can be a politician. You can do all of these things. It's possible for you to do that, and then to see role models of good families, of good morals, of people who represented the good qualities of manhood and womanhood. Those were oftentimes not easy to see. It's not that they weren't there; they certainly were there. But because we were oftentimes kind of dealing with a broader society that seemed to stigmatize and stereotype us in a negative way, it was that we were trying to confront, and it was that we wanted to empower ourselves against, somehow. So that can lead a lot of young people towards picking up role models, picking up cultural identities and stereotypes. Feeling like this is their only pathway to money, to success, and that it's also a means of gaining respect. People, a lot of young Black guys in communities I came from. If you wanted respect, there was a way to get it. In low income environments, oftentimes, and you wanted people to kind of maybe even feel a fear, a bit of intimidation around you, a bit of a sense that somehow like you had something that was unique about you, that could end up putting you into the wrong environment around the wrong people, just to kind of gain a little bit of local credibility, but in the process end up harming yourself, and end up really dislocating you entirely from the values and the community that you originate from.
Excellent points once again. And, my thinking, I'd like to go towards right now, what I feel what we've been talking about is all leading up to a vicious circle, right? But I'm trying to get out of that mentality to see where the light is in all of this. But before we move into that, maybe one other area that I think is really worth exploring, especially because of your unique perspective and your line of work and what you've experienced and who you've encountered, is this whole notion of discrimination, prejudice, bias, and a lot of this is structural, right? A lot of this is in the system playing against you as you're growing up with this identity and with this outlook on life as you described. So, where would you say are the issues? Is it more, at the individual level with discrimination and feelings of racism stemming, let's say, from ideological reasons or other, or is it more systemic? And then we'll move into hopefully starting to look at, so now what?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, a lot of times when people say, we talk about, racism, systemic racism, it seems like a concept that people don't understand. So, institutions are made up of people, right? They're made up of individual peoples who help form institutions. Those individual people come and they then create rules. They draft policies, legislation that reinforce whatever prejudices and biases or thoughts that they hold about themselves. And if those people who are doing that are not representative of the broader society, or they're only representative of a certain category of experience, then they're going to reinforce patterns of dominance, exclusion, of dislocation, and of oppression that currently already exist or have been in existence. And that's what we mean by systemic racism. That the society, the rules, the institutions, from the economic systems, the financial systems, from the educational systems, from the social service institutes that govern and that rule over us and that help uphold the rule of law, if they are not self-reflecting on how they're creating patterns of disparity between groups, then they're perpetuating a type of discrimination, right? So in law, for example, a person doesn't have to say, "I don't like you because Jafar, you're a Muslim guy. I don't like your name. You sound like you're from the Middle East." It doesn't have to be that direct. It can be very subtle. It could be that because Jafar comes from a particular background or a particular neighborhood, I set the rules at a certain level that discriminates against him, right? Because his family is from a particular part of the world. If I treat all of those, if I imagine that I'm just going to treat everybody right the same, then that's going to have some outcomes that are unfair, right? This is the difference between equality and equity, right? You're not focusing on what's uniquely different about people, and that's what we try to get people to do, and that's what we try to encourage government to do. So anybody who's worked, for example, in government, where the vast majority of the rules that govern our society are drafted, are enforced, you'll find that there's sometimes a lack of awareness, even if you will, about the ways in which like the rules are impacting people. A few years ago, the rates at which Black youth, for example, in Toronto District School Board, were dropping out. It was something crazy. Almost 40% of Black youth were not completing a high school. This was maybe 10-15 years ago, and they had to go and they had to look what's going on. Why are so many Black youth not completing high school? Is it because they just don't like to study? Is it because there's something wrong with them? It's like what is going on? And eventually they start to realize that many of these youth are coming from environments and places where they don't see themselves represented within the school at all. It's normal for you to aspire when you see something before you that you can relate to. So if a curriculum doesn't have you reflected in there, if I'm learning about history and culture and civilization, and there's nothing in there that seems to demonstrate that I exist or my people have been around here, then I might feel less than motivated. I might feel less than interested in learning about just your culture, right? If all of my teachers, none of them come or look like me or can understand my experience, don't understand what it means to be an immigrant, to be a refugee, to have come from places in the world where there have been various types of conflict, where our communities were for a long time oppressed. These things require a certain understanding and awareness. But again, it's more than that. A friend of mine, she just completed a study talking about the 1.5 and second generation West Africans in Toronto, and how many of them who were kind of living in sort of low income communities, when they would apply for jobs, they would change their addresses, right? Because you don't want the employer to know where you live, right? Because there's stigmas around certain communities, certain neighborhoods, right? So I would put my name, and maybe if I had a cousin that lived in a better neighborhood, I would put that neighborhood, right? Because I know that if they find out I live at the intersection of so and so, that they might think something bad about me, or that they might group me in a particularly negative uh, negative way. So you're constantly fighting that sense of, I want to avoid being pigeonholed into some kind of negative trope, and I want to find a way to give myself the best shot at an individual level. When we talk about discrimination, I mean, discrimination happens on so many grounds. It's obviously not just racial, not just ethnic. It's even in marital status. It could be in age, it could be in sexual orientation, it could be so many different things about you, and that could affect you. That could affect your ability to get housing, right? That could be get your so that's a very common experience for many Black people who, when they're looking for a place to rent, right? They are dealing with many non-Black landlords, and they don't want to rent to them, right? They don't want too many Black looking people in a certain community. They feel that it could be bad for the neighborhood. This is the psychology of what you're dealing with, right? As a Black person, as a racialized person in this society, and all you're doing is just trying to live your life, right? All you're doing is trying to do what other people do normally, in hopes of getting the same opportunity, right? There's you might want to start your own business, but good luck trying to get a loan, right? The hurdles that are sort of somehow put in front of you, again, these are not just anecdotal things. There's plenty of data to demonstrate that this has been happening for a long time. These things have been put in place, and so you find that Black people are rejected at higher rates for financial loans that could have helped give us economic stability in businesses, and to move out of some of the communities that were stigmatized or had many challenges within them. But racism, discrimination, it's a psychosocial phenomenon that isn't just something that you experience obviously in North America. It's something that it's a global phenomenon that I think anywhere in the world we can see the elements of group othering, exclusion, and a belief that some group is superior because of some inherent quality or trait that they have vis-a-vis some other group. And that to me is kind of what's at the root of this idea that I want to one group wants to feel empowered over another group, and through that process they want to create stereotypes and institutions, and that will reinforce to themselves that, hey, yes, we are the dominant group, we are the superior group, we excel over this such and such group. And it can be the same people in a particular area, and yet those same people, when they come to it could be two different cultural or groups or clans or tribes. And then when they come to North America, like, there is no differentiation between them as a group vis-a-vis the more dominant society. So it just goes to show you the relativeness. Oh, sorry, the office lights here are going off and on and off. I may have to just go run and turn them on. But it just goes to show you that there's a tendency amongst groups to want to exclude others for the sake of upholding their sense of self-worth. And that can be very dangerous. And that's really what's at the root of the institutions and individual encounters of discrimination and racism that we're talking about.
Absolutely. So let me build on this, these last points that you are making, building all the way from the systemic discrimination, racism, and hopefully we can build into hopefully some remedies and solutions to all of this. So, without naming any names, I know there's a lot large institutions, corporations, multinationals, and others. When they look, for instance, at to what extent they are representative of society, or at least that's how it's presented. When you start drilling down into their data, you see, for instance, that they break down the types of employees that they have. So, for instance, they're going to look at their executive suite, their executive rank, and they're going to see, do we have, 3% of them who are of a certain color, and so on and so forth. And then they will do that, for instance, in the same way with their entry levels. And they will have categories in this way. And at the end of it, they will say, did we meet the standards that we set for ourselves? And usually these standards are supposed to match what's available in the market. That's how it's presented. The issue in a lot of these cases is that we all know that the majority of the executives that will make it to the executive level are those who actually grew up in the company. And the majority of those who are at an entry level today will not make it into an executive level, right? So maybe 1 in 100. It depends on the ratio, depending on where you are. So with that in mind, this is where you see that if you do not take into consideration that you need a much higher pool, a much bigger pool of entry levels of a certain group, of a certain denomination, whatever it may be, entered into a corporation, entered into a multinational, they will never make it. You will never reach those numbers at your executive ranks, right? So
Yeah.
this is, I think, something that we need to keep in mind, and I'm gonna link it to the other theme that you were talking about, which is the underrepresentation. And where do we go from here? So obviously, the excellent point that you raised is that a lot of this is because those who are in power, the institutions are made up of human beings, and those human beings don't know what they don't know. They keep perpetuating what's already in place. And this creates the systems and the systemic issues that we're talking about. And a lot of this is because there's an underrepresentation, right? So those who are making making the decisions and working on policy, for instance, are lacking that knowledge and that awareness, not consciously in a lot of cases. So how do we start moving in that direction? Because as I said before, I think there's a little bit of a vicious circle, right? Where there are things in place that seem to be at least hindering, they're barriers, preventing those who want even to get into these systems. What do we need to do? Where do we start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so this is a problem that exists, from the very basic levels of human interaction and engagement to all the way up to the highest levels of government and the concentric levels of power that we have. In a country like Canada, there's been a historical reluctance to sort of maintain data, so disaggregated data on various groups. Only recently has this idea of ensuring that we need to collect information, right? Because I can go and tell you that, hey, listen, I believe that 90% of all of your racialized employees will never ever make it to senior level in a particular institution. Why is that? Are they all not competent? Do they all not have the capacity? Why is it that a certain demographic is entirely dominated by one segment of society? Does it match the societal numbers? Does it match their their levels of education? What's happening here in terms of the demographic data that we have, the educational data that we have, and the outcomes that we're seeing in institutions that hold and reign power, right, over us. And so now what the government, I'm talking about the federal government, what they've started to do is they recognize that we got to start collecting data, because it's not enough for us to say, oh, we think there's a problem. Well, and it's not enough for a racialized person or a group to say, we think there's a problem. Someone's going to say, prove that there's a problem, right? What's your evidence that there's a problem? You're saying that there's systemic racism. How do we know that there's systemic racism, right? If you're saying that, something like 30 or 40% of youth in the child welfare system in the city of Toronto, for example, are Black youth, despite the fact that Black people only comprise 8% of the population, right? Like, if I say that, they're gonna want evidence for that. They're gonna need to. If you're telling me that at executive levels, despite the fact that Black Canadians make up 3.5% or something like that of the population, not they're less than 0.3% of people at these sort of like executive level C-suite type of positions. Now, this is important, right? Because we're talking about what causes a person to feel like they don't belong, right? Going back to this question, what makes someone feel like I belong to a different group? I am an outsider, and I'm not somebody who should even bother aspiring to to become this person in this particular field, or to challenge this particular issue. There's an element of that comes from the fact that you're not seeing representation at a particular level, and it affects decision making, right? It affects outcomes. It affects so many different aspects of the issue. So I mean, if I would say like to the first thing that has to happen is that there has to be an acknowledgement of the problem, right? For a long time, this conversation around diversity, inclusion, racism, prejudice, both individually and systemically, it's denied, right? It's denied, right? Why is it denied? Why? Because, well, Canada is a country, that accepts immigrants from all over the place, right? Canada is a country that has, 300,000 people coming in from around the world every year. So you have these kinds of patterns that make people believe that, oh, there's no issue here, there's no problem, and again, that reflects a particular perspective. But for you to overcome that, you're going to need oftentimes information. Now that creates a problem because to gather information, you need the people who want to gather information to believe that it's worthwhile, and those people tend to not want to gather that information, right? Or they don't want to dedicate those resources. So it's a vicious cycle, right? But however, if you had somebody there in those environments, at that decision-making table, who could say, you know what, actually, I that is an issue. I do think that's relevant. Then you can start making those decisions. We've seen this happen, particularly around the inclusion of women. So, decades ago, you would have never seen women in senior roles in many of these companies and in government. Don't get me wrong, there's still a major issue, particularly in the private sector at executive levels when it comes to women's representation. But when you drill down further into which women are there, there's an even bigger problem, right? So again, it reinforces this idea that power is going to only belong to a certain group in this society. And ultimately, that's what we're talking about. Who gets access to power? Who gets access to decision making? Who gets access to the distribution of resources and opportunity? And if a society fractures too much along those lines, you're going to have problems. Whether it's Canada, whether it's Ghana, whether it's the Philippines, it doesn't matter. If eventually there's the fault lines are so there's a disparity between groups, and it becomes more and more readily apparent, you're gonna have social disintegration, and with social disintegration comes all kinds of problems, right? That can lead people to be taking on extremist ideas, taking on a belief that I need to do something extreme. I need to do something.
I think we're seeing a lot of that in the world right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
People who feel disenfranchised, right? So who feel a little bit outside, that the current systems are not really speaking to them. They don't identify with them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that swings along a pendulum, because once an excluded group starts to get a little bit of seeming sort of attraction or brought in a little bit. Yeah, success. Then you see that reaction. Oh, well, from a demographic that feels threatened now. Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'm losing my power again, which speaks to the fact that there is always this sense of entitlement about who should occupy certain roles, who should be where in society. So we have to challenge that. otherwise, like any civilization before, eventually the more you have exclusion and the haves and the have-nots, and the more fault lines are reflected across particular demographics, the more you get people who don't want to know each other anymore, right? Or who have adopted ideas about the other that are oftentimes not realistic, right? So it's an active attempt. It's really more than just representation and diversity. It's really about the basis of what a society and a civilization is, which is a recognition that it's a competing space that constantly needs a self-present awareness of where people are being left behind and what needs to be done to maintain social cohesion, opportunity, and balance. Because if you don't do that, then we'll run into very serious problems.
A lot of in what you're saying, I think, can be at least alleviated. I think with strong leadership, people who recognize that there is a problem and who start working to show that there is a problem, doing it the right way, evidence-based way, raising the awareness, for instance. Some of the initiatives that you mentioned and you began this session with, I think go in that direction. I think you've taken that leadership role because you felt that there are specific issues that can be, at least tackled in certain ways. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And then I'd like to start talking about, what is your take or your assessment right now of what the communities themselves are trying to do to help themselves out of these situations?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, the reason why I've gotten involved in Muslim community, in particular, it has a lot to do with my own background. So, I mean, I've worked in politics here in the province of Ontario, for cabinet ministers. I've seen lack of representation, both within multiple communities, the Black community, the Muslim community. Various communities are extremely underrepresented, and these are spaces of power and privilege. And insight, and there are spaces where you get access to information that can help a community or a social issue. So for me, I understand that, like, okay, I've been fortunate to have gotten into this space, and what's interesting is that I only got into that space because of another Black woman who brought me into that space, who said, we need more, we need someone like you here. So as I got into that space, I said, okay, wow, well, this space needs diversity in opinion, right? Otherwise, you're gonna run into sort of uniform thinking here, right? And that's always a threat. I got involved with what we call the Muslim Youth Fellowship, which is a project to increase the civic engagement politically of Muslim youth in and around the Greater Toronto area. And to give them sort of political training, engagement, awareness, understanding of the political institutions that are around them. We were able to partner with the City of Toronto. We got the mayor's endorsement, many city councilors' endorsements to create an official program where Muslim youth would, and again, this is you identify as Muslim, ahlan wa sahlan, as they say, right? Come, no problem, right? So you come, you identify as Muslim. You come, you care about, you're interested in politics. We'll give you an opportunity to get training, access to some of the leading political thinkers, strategists, the various political parties, and then you're gonna get a chance to also work in a city council office, get paid, right? Like get some real experience. That's your opportunity to get into politics, get into the civil service, understand how decisions are being made. That was an interest of interest to me. As a Black guy who became Muslim, when I became Muslim, I started interacting with the Muslim community in a way that I had never interacted with before. Now, I lived in a community where the local mosque was primarily South Asian, many South Asian brothers and sisters, and in conversation with them, I started to realize that okay, they don't really know much about Black Canadians or the diversity of Black Canadians. They don't really know much. And sometimes it's not always malicious. It's just kind of out of ignorance, really. But those things can harm people, right? They can really have an effect on people because if you're not careful, you could really make someone feel
Yeah.
unwelcome in a space. And that can have an effect on their religiosity, their commitment to, developing good values that can help the society, all of us, right? So over time, I started to realize that, okay, well, uh, there needs to be a space where a person who, is dealing with the issues and uniqueness of being Black in North America and in Canada can feel
Mhm.
welcome, right? And at the same time, they can also feel like they can bring their full self as a Muslim and not be questioned in a particular way. People kind of sometimes think, you know, there aren't many Black Muslims or something like that, or Black Islam is new to Black people or something like that, right? So these are deeply problematic assumptions and presumptions that can be very harmful for someone's personal and religious development. So through a couple of friends of mine, we started this organization that we wanted to do, as I talked about, we wanted to do research. We want to find out, okay, so who are the Black Muslim communities? So in Canada, if you're Sudani, of a certain complexion, they consider you Black. Okay, so they're Black. Here, you're Somali, you're Black. You're Nigerian, you're Black. All of us became Black, right? And the dominance, the society views us as Black. So we understood that, and and the children that are growing up here understand that, right? So we want to learn more about these communities. We want to learn more about how they're interacting with their religious institutions and environments. Right? Do they feel like the imams are aware of what they're experiencing, right, in their everyday life? Do they understand the challenges that they have? Can the imams appropriately address these issues? And oftentimes we found that there was a bit of a disconnect, and there was almost discomfort. We would say, something happens and it affects you as a Black person. You see a Black person being, targeted. You see, police brutality, and it affects you, and you want the imams to identify with that and to feel a sense of, a sense of being bothered by this, and you don't get that, right? Something happens in a part of the world that is primarily
Mhm.
Black. You don't hear them talking about it in the khutbah. Brother, we need to raise money to help, Somalia, Chad, Central African Republic. I've only heard one person ever in my life on all the Friday Jummahs I've gone to ever mention the Central African Republic, and in a country where Muslims have been completely, run out of. They banned mosques in Angola. There are so many places that you don't even know about. But we end up hearing more and more about, only certain parts of the Muslim world, as if that's where Muslims are, right? As if that's the only place where Muslims are, and that's problematic because it reinforces this idea that even within my own community, the broader Muslim community, I'm second class, right? And that's very problematic. So we wanted to kind of engage in these issues and ideas in a meaningful way, and to create space for people who are experiencing this to feel like, hey, you know what, we get it, we understand what you're going through. Where there are people who are trained and learning about these things. Sometimes even when you're studying, traditional Islamic studies and sciences, you encounter some things that have been written about Black people that are very problematic. You encounter things that you say, wow, these people, it's very prejudiced. In fact, it's completely un-Islamic. You know what I mean? And yet they're being
Yeah.
praised, right, by your scholars and the leaders. So how does that make you feel inside? And you're supposed to take these people up as examples for yourself. So it becomes a reinforcing issue in many parts of a person's sort of mental health and spiritual health and personal well-being. But there are so many interlocking factors about it, and so we wanted to kind of create an institution, organization that would be a resource for understanding these challenges, these problems, both in the traditional context and outside of the traditional context, both within the Muslim community and outside of the Muslim community. I often say that what people don't realize is that in the North American context, the community that's most likely to be interested in Islam, any denomination, are Black Americans, right? You see this all the time. Why is that? Why is it that Black Americans, particularly in the United States, right there, they're way more likely to be interested in Islam and what it can do for them, how it can help reform their communities, their societies. The same thing that Malcolm X went through, right? There was something about the Islamic way of life that was attractive,
Mm-hmm.
that made sense for what they've experienced, that was healing to them. But if the Muslim community is not going out to these people and their communities, then who's going to do that, right? If there's a sense that, well, I gotta stay in my mosque, I gotta stay in my Arab mosque, I gotta stay in my Pakistani mosque, I gotta stay in my Iranian mosque, I gotta stay in my, um, uh, Kurdish mosque, I gotta stay in my. If I'm staying in all, you guys are all staying in your mosques, and there are communities here that could benefit from Islam, then you have to bring Islam to them. But if you feel like they're not your brothers, they have no connection to them, then you won't do that. So for me, I feel a connection, obviously because of my complexion, my ethnic background, to many of these brothers, even if they're not
Mm-hmm.
Muslim, right? I know many of the experiences that they've gone through. I've gone through them myself. So I wanted to be somebody who could be a bridge in many ways for some of these brothers and sisters. I've met Black Muslims who have left Islam because they couldn't find an environment, right, that understood what they were going through. And so through these experiences, I got into touch with a few friends that I've known over the years, and we started creating this thing called the Black Muslim Initiative, in hopes of doing this advocacy work, right? In hopes of doing developing resources and research, in hopes of inviting Islamic scholarship to Islamic scholars rather to come and give lectures and share information and to educate the community about the Black experience and the Black presence in Islam from the very outset, because we know that that's at the heart and the root of it. So all of these things are important and are critical. We're actually working right now towards developing some kind of community center, because we recognize that the mosque environment isn't always easy for people to sort of be engaged with, and that's been one of the ways that we've been hoping to sort of help support this community, the Black Muslim community, as diverse as it is, in some small way through this kind of work. So
These are
I
all,
apologize. That was a bit
great, amazing, creative ways of addressing a lot of these issues. And I think there's also the uniqueness of your perspective. As a convert, I think it also adds another layer for you to be able to really assess more objectively what's going on within these communities, as opposed to someone who has perhaps just grown up in them. So you're too close to some things, you fail to see them. And thank you for all of these, insights, but also the work that you're doing. I think it's absolutely amazing. If I can take it now one step further and now look at the role that governments can play. So, the three orders of government, you're talking about municipal, provincial, federal, and you already started touching on a lot of this. And there's, I think, two streams to the way that governments can help. There's obviously the interventionist way. So the problem has already occurred, the issue is already on the ground, and we're trying to deal with it. And you have the preventative way. So your experience until now, through your own organizations and through what you're noticing in the community, does currently what exists, is it enough? And are we simply failing to tap into it sufficiently? Is there more work required? Do you feel that the intervention should simply take the form of money thrown at community initiatives and then the community does it by themselves, and so it's indirect? Or is it more direct, where the government sets up programs, policies, services, and then people can access them directly?
Yeah, good question, right? So there's always that tension with any kind of community development work, right? Do you rely on government, or do you try to utilize government in its appropriate way, or in a particular way rather? I shouldn't presume it's appropriate, in a particular way, and then kind of give it over to the community to do this kind of work. Should others, non-government stakeholders or groups or entities, be involved? Absolutely, right? So you have to first and foremost understand the challenges you're trying to address, right? So, speaking about the Black Muslim community, for example. So, again, I can speak about Toronto, the environment that I grew up in, I'm more familiar with. But, if you come to Toronto and you come into sort of the sort of low income communities, there's a disproportionately high number of Black Muslims in these environments, right? If you go into into courthouses, there's a disproportionately high number of Black Muslims you'll find there, right? If you go into the economic data about educational outcomes and places of leadership, again, you kind of find that disproportionately there are certain groups that are underrepresented or are more on the negative side of the scale, right? Kind of like you find it in many data indicators with indigenous communities, right? So that has necessitated the creation of specific targeted programs for these communities, right? Recognizing that some groups are affected and are impacted more than others. In Canada, many people who came from Black Muslim countries, predominantly Black Muslim countries, they came from situations of civil war. They were not economic migrants, right? So they came oftentimes as refugees. That's a very different experience than somebody who comes here and they have their education and they speak some English and whatnot, and they can kind of seemingly transition a bit better, and aren't encumbered in particular ways. Now, there's all these other layers of challenges, right? So, prior to the number of sort of Black Muslim immigrant groups that came here, you were dealing with communities like, from many times from the Caribbean, many of whom were also sort of, experiencing like outrageous levels of discrimination and racism and prejudice and socioeconomic opportunity. So what happens is that those groups that came from the Black Muslim countries, they end up kind of being, sort of lumped into these environments, and they now are experiencing some of the same things that these earlier Black communities were experiencing, right? And now the challenge is, how do we assist, this group to make sure that their children have the same level of opportunity, access that anybody has, right? And if we're noticing through data that, hey, listen, there's so much evidence that here there are so many negative outcomes that are coming about, we have to ask why that is, right? And it's intertwined with a lot of what we talked about already. It's not just because of their vulnerability, but it's also because of the way in which the power structures exist. I'll give you an example. I went to the University of Toronto for my undergraduate schooling, and you walk around campus on Friday nights. Sometimes there are frat houses there, fraternity frat houses, and they'll have parties and stuff like that. And I used to live whilst I was doing my schooling in undergrad. I was living in the same, I guess, Toronto community housing community that I grew up in, and so I would go back into the community and from downtown Toronto, and then again high rates of police presence in these areas. What's interesting is that in those communities, you would be so afraid, or the people would be so afraid there to encounter police, oftentimes because if they had some, let's say marijuana or something like that on them, that was a real problem or potential that you could end up getting arrested, charged, and thrown into jail. When I used to walk around the campus at University of Toronto on Friday nights, I smelled marijuana coming out of the frat houses. Okay, you would smell marijuana on the streets. Okay, sometimes, and I thought to myself, wow, this is interesting, but there is no police presence there. There's a university police, and they've contracted with the Toronto police not to have the Toronto police come to these places. Because why? They don't want Toronto police arresting university students over what? Minor things having to do with marijuana. Now, take the subway, go down a few blocks, and people are paranoid about police arresting them for a marijuana, right? So these are the kind of things that and if you get a marijuana charge, like now that affects your employment. Every time you apply for a job, your criminal record background check is going to be checked. It completely destroys your life, right? For example, but there's no data that demonstrates that somehow people in low income communities utilize marijuana at a higher rate than people who are not in these communities. It's that the police don't police these areas, right? They don't police these areas, and the higher up you go in society, the more you realize, sometimes these same people were utilizing marijuana, the same people who were criminalizing these communities for something like marijuana. And I'm not trying to say marijuana is okay. I'm just telling you that how a policy and a law can be utilized to target already disenfranchised people, and it's not applied the same way to another group of people, right? So you have elements of economic privilege and racism that has a deep impact. But I know I've veered off the question a little bit. I apologize for that. But I would say, the more you have from community, even private sector. The work I do with the Black Muslim Initiative, we want to engage the private sector. We want to engage philanthropy. We want to engage government. Right? We've consulted on with government on issues having to do with support for the Black community. If, for example, small businesses are very vulnerable at this particular time, the statistics for Black community, small Black business, is at a higher level. So, government has to be responsive to that, right? If 30-40% of small businesses are not going to make it out of this pandemic, I guarantee you the numbers in Black small business community is 70-80%. So that means government has to be attuned to that a bit more, right? You can't put out the same policies for everybody and think that it's going to work. They say that we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, right? So that's the reality of what we're trying to help government address. The government has started to talk about anti-racism, anti-Black racism, discrimination a lot more openly. They're actually conducting a review of hiring practices. You don't find many racialized people at very high levels within the public service. That's not by accident, right? These people are not being invited to the golf courses, right, and to the bars, right? So they're excluded from certain conversations that ensure a certain demographic, a small group of people keep being put in positions of power, and that reinforce the sort of sense of disenfranchisement that other groups feel. So it's a very, very long-term comprehensive issues. There are religious elements. Many communities that identify as Black and Muslim, many of them, adopted very conservative, positions on issues of Islamic law that gives them a unique challenge in terms of trying to escape, housing issues, right? Concerns about riba and interest and these sort of things. You find that in certain parts of the Black Muslim community, people are very, very concerned with this issue, and therefore they're less likely to want to even purchase homes and engage traditional lending institutions. So that's a whole other conversation. But again, it's just to show you the interconnectedness of religion and identity, and how these things reinforce socioeconomic disparity.
Of course, and the youth are growing in that kind of environment, right?
Exactly, right? So your youth are now stuck in that environment that's over policed, that's likely where there are so many pathways for them to get pulled into the wrong crowd, right? So we have to be talking about that, and you can't issue the same ruling for one group of people that you issue for another group of people. If one group of Muslims came here as economic migrants and were able to afford houses, another group went into low income communities, ghettoized areas. You can't apply the same rules to them. I've heard scholars, imams say you can't go out and get loans for education because it's there's interest. And applying very, very strict rulings. What that means is that family now can't access potentially opportunity to further their children's educational development, right? And so that just reinforces the notion that they might now they might have to get low income work, stay in the same low income areas. It's a vicious cycle. So we have to be cognizant of these things.
Absolutely. Well, I feel that we have traveled far and wide in our rich, amazing discussion that we have had. And we have perhaps, I don't know if we've even scratched the surface yet. But I think that it was an absolutely fascinating talk. We talked about history. We talked about the variety of the diasporas that exist in these societies, and we discussed identity issues, the socioeconomic realities on the ground, and how policies are formulated. And of course, we talked about your own journey and your own leadership and initiatives in trying to step up and give back. And all of this is absolutely amazing work. So on my side, all I've left to do is to thank you on behalf of the team for your team, your personal accounts and your insight and your perspective. And hopefully that our viewers enjoyed this as much as we did here. And hopefully our viewers will want to get more in our next episodes. So thank you from deep from within our hearts.
No problem. It's been my pleasure. Jazakallah khair. It's been, I appreciate the opportunity. I hope, inshallah, that anything I've said has been helpful and beneficial, and that, some good will come out of it. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.